Alright gang, so here we are. We finally made it. We made it through all the prokaryotes. We made it through the bacteria and the archaea. We made it through the protists. We made it through plants. We made it through simple animals. We're all the way up finally to the group that would include us, and that would be vertebrates, creatures with a backbone. Now of course that's going to include far more than just humans. It's going to include far more than just mammals. It's going to include birds and reptiles and frogs and a wide variety of creatures that you may think are fairly far from being human. But this is the overall group that we belong to. And so chapter 34 is the origin and evolution of vertebrates. And as we have done with the previous chapters, we're not going to focus on any one particular species, although I will say the end of the chapter does kind of delve into the development of the human species, Homo sapiens. So we will spend a little bit of time on that, obviously, for obvious reasons. But for the most part, we're going to try to stick with the major categories and trying to figure out why some creatures fall into certain groups and not into others, and what are the differences between one group and another, and what, say, for example, what are the characteristics of an amniote or the characteristics of some particular, say, a tetrapod or something like that. So we're looking more for the broad categories, and basically we're also looking for these overarching ideas of how all this fits together. So going all the way back from the archaea and the bacteria all the way up to, say, human beings and primates and mammals, trying to figure out how all this fits together and trying to make sense of all this. Now this, as an intro to biology course or as a basic biology course, this is what you would call a survey course. You could spend entire semesters or entire years studying only one small portion of all the life that we've studied. You can spend an entire scientific career studying, E. coli bacteria or one particular branch of reptiles, but we are just taking a basic survey, trying to fit in as much as we can and trying to make sense of it all and see how they all fit together. So chapter 34 is going to end us out with all these different types of creatures, the origin and evolution of vertebrates. Let's get started. Our chapter overview starts with a basic history. It says 500 million years of backbones. So compared to some of the other creatures that have been around, creatures with backbones have not been around for as long, although they still have been around for quite some time. Early in the Cambrian period, about 530 million years ago, an astonishing variety of invertebrates animals inhabited Earth's oceans. At that time, most of the life on Earth was of the invertebrate, the non-backbone variety. One type of animal gave rise to vertebrates, and they became one of the most successful groups of animals on the planet. So the variety of vertebrates, from fish to amphibians to mammals, is pretty astounding, and they do hold a great deal of sway, of course, now on the Earth. The animals called vertebrates get their name, of course, from their vertebrae, the series of bones that make up their backbone. And that would be us. So finally, this would include the group that humans would be a part of. And although the number of vertebrates is fairly small overall, there's maybe about 52,000 species. Compare that to, say, over 1 million species of insects. The disparity or variety, the differences among them is pretty mind-boggling. I mean, you go from a gecko to an enormous blue whale, so you have a tremendous amount of variety among the vertebrates, and they are found in a tremendous number of habitats as well. Your textbook shows you a great picture of this fossil and says, what is the relationship of this ancient organism to humans? And of course the relationship is that this tiny little 3 centimeter long ancient relative of all extant vertebrates. So that would include human beings. So this little creature is an ancient relative of a common ancestor of all vertebrates. This little guy would have been alive in the Cambrian period about 530 million years ago. One lineage of vertebrates colonized the land about 365 million years ago, so we finally have come ashore, and there are about 52,000 species of vertebrates, as I mentioned, including the largest organisms ever to live on the Earth. The blue whale, which is alive and around today, of course, is larger than any dinosaur that ever existed. So you could go and potentially see the largest animal that has ever lived on Earth, and it surpasses even the dinosaurs. Vertebrates have great disparity. Again, a mind-boggling kind of array of differences in body shape and size and morphology and that type of thing. We're going to get started here with concept 34.1. It says chordates have a notochord and a dorsal hollow nerve cord. So we're going to start by talking about the largest of groups, which is going to be chordates. Chordates, the phylum Chordata, are bilaterian. Remember that means they have bilateral symmetry. They are bilaterian animals that belong to the clade of animals known as Deuterostomia. Chordates comprise all vertebrates and 2 groups of invertebrates, the urochordates, sorry about that, and the cephalochordates. So a chordate would be a creature that has what we call a notochord and a dorsal hollow nerve cord. We'll discuss that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. And that would include all of the vertebrates plus two other smaller groups off to the side. So here we go. This is our ancestral deuterostome that led to the notochord. And so here we would have all of the chordates. So that would include all of these guys, everything that you see here, plus these two other varieties, the urochordates and the cephalochordata here. So you can see that there is a close relative of ours that we've already talked about in, say, like the starfish or the sea stars, but it is not considered a chordate. It doesn't have some of these features we're about to talk about. And then we have these cephalochordata and urochordata, which are very closely related to all the other chordates, but they're slightly different from them. So we'll talk about those briefly, and then we'll kind of go on down the list. And you can see we're going to, oops, sorry about that. You can see we are going to basically narrow and become more and more narrow as we get down to, say, mammalia, which would include all mammals like humans and primates and dogs and cattle and that type of thing. So you can see some of the categories, and this would be a slide that I would really hang on to. That's why I put a star on it, because not only does it give you all of the different categories of creatures we're going to look at, starting with the chordates and then all the way down to the amniotes and then all the way down to the mammals themselves, but it also kind of tells you some of the major features that separate these groups. So this particular slide I think is of particular importance. It's figure 34.2 in your textbook, and I believe that is on page 698. So I would make sure and kind of take a look at that. It's almost like a visual summary of what we're about to talk about. So let's look at some of the derived characters of chordates. All chordates share a set of what we call derived characters. Some species have some of these traits only during embryonic development. So what we're saying here is that the adult form of these creatures don't all have all four of these things, but at some point in its development, oftentimes early in the embryonic development, you're going to see at some point in its life all four of these key characteristics. So those four key characters are the notochord, the dorsal hollow nerve cord, the pharyngeal slits or clefts, and a muscular post-anal tail. A good place to start with studying the chordates or the vertebrates in general would be the related crash course video. He does a great job talking about the various vertebrates and the chordates, and so I would go check out the crash course video. Again, I think they do a great job in those videos of summarizing the information and doing it in a fairly amusing or at least engaging manner. So let's take a look at a basic chordate here. This is not any one particular animal, but it's going to show you all the four things that we're going to be looking for. So we have what's called a notochord, and that's going to be this line right here. We're going to find out what a notochord is in more detail in just a second. A dorsal, meaning on the back side, a dorsal hollow nerve cord, and then we have pharyngeal slits or clefts, and a muscular post-anal tail. And that would be the anus opening here. Post-anal just means behind or back beyond that. And then they show you a mouth and some muscle segments. But those four here in the squares are the four things that make up a chordate. All chordates have this at some point in their development. So let's start with that notochord. The notochord is longitudinal, which means it runs along the long side or the lengthways side of the animal. Flexible rod between the digestive tube and the nerve cord. So here's that notochord. It's between the digestive tube and the nerve cord. A flexible rod of sort of cartilaginous material provides skeletal support throughout most of the length of the chordate. In most vertebrates, a more complex jointed skeleton eventually develops and replaces that notochord, and the adult retains only little pieces or remnants of the embryonic notochord. A good example of this would be in humans. In human embryos, you'll see a notochord, but that notochord kind of changes, and basically all you have left once the baby is born and then becomes an adult is the cartilage disc between the vertebrae of the backbone. That's what remains of the notochord that you're going to see in the embryo of a human. They also have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. The nerve cord of a chordate embryo develops from a plate of ectoderm. Remember, that's the outer tissue. Remember, I said the outer tissue, the ectoderm, also forms the basic spinal column, or the spinal, I would say the spinal cord and nervous system and brain of the creature. So the nerve cord of a chordate embryo develops from the plate of ectoderm that rolls into a tube dorsal to the notochord, again on the back. The nerve cord develops into the central nervous system, which would include the brain and the spinal cord. Other animal phyla have solid nerve cords, and in most cases they're located ventrally. So there are other creatures that have nerve cords, but they are not of the same formation, and they're not in the same spot. They're located ventrally, which would be like the stomach side of the creature, as opposed to here, dorsally, the back side. Pharyngeal slits or clefts. In most chordates, grooves in the pharynx, called pharyngeal clefts, develop into slits that open to the outside of the body. And depending on the type of creature, it kind of determines what's going to happen to these pharyngeal slits. They are suspension feeding structures in many invertebrate chordates. So there are a lot of remember, there was two classes of invertebrate chordates we're going to talk about, and these pharyngeal slits are kind of like filters where they filter food out from the water around them. Gas exchange in vertebrates, say for example in fish, that's the most common example. These pharyngeal slits become the gills of the fish and allow for gas exchange, and this is true in all of the vertebrates except the ones that have limbs, tetrapods, and that would be mammals and amphibians and birds and that type of thing. In those types of creatures, they develop into parts of the ear and head and neck. So in tetrapods like birds, reptiles, and mammals, those pharyngeal slits are there in the embryo, but you won't find them in the newborn creature, or certainly not in the adult creature. They develop into other parts of the head, neck, that area, ear area. Last but not least, the fourth characteristic of a chordate is a muscular postanal tail. Chordates have a tail posterior to the anus. In many species, the tail becomes greatly reduced during embryonic development, such as humans. The vast majority of humans have no tail at all, or very little of a tail. If you look at the skeletal system of a human, you will see a tailbone, and you can see where a tail would have been, but for most humans it's virtually non-existent. The tail contains skeletal elements and muscles, and it provides for many of these creatures a propelling force in many aquatic species. Like think about fish or creatures like that use their tail as part of their mechanism for moving around. So those are the four characteristics of a chordate. Now what we're going to do is we're going to step down through these categories, and we're going to get more and more specific all along the way. There is no way that I would expect you to memorize, say, the names of all these particular categories that you see right here. That would be far too much to ask in the short time that we have. But we want to try to know what makes one category of creature different from another. So don't really focus on these names right here. Focus on these categories: chordates, craniates, vertebrates, gnadostomes, lobe fins, tetrapods, amniotes. Focus on the categories of creatures and what separate these categories one from the other, and you'll be much better off doing it that way. So let's start out with a group called the Cephalochordata, some of the most basic of the chordates, very simple chordates. So we're going to start with what's called a lancelet. A lancelet or a Cephalochordata are named for their blade-like shape, and when you see a picture you'll see it kind of looks like a knife blade. They are marine suspension feeders that retain characteristics of the chordate body plan as adults. So they still have kind of all four of those features even as adults. They're very simplistic. So here they are, and here's what it looks like, and you can see it does look kind of like a knife blade, and you can see it has these pharyngeal slits and the notochord and the dorsal hollow nerve cord, and of course a tail, and that's what it looks like. Whoops, sorry about that. That's what it looks like as an adult that you see on the right here. So this is a very simplistic creature. It is a chordate. It does have all four of the characteristics of a chordate, but it's a very simple one. Now keep in mind this is an invertebrate chordate. In other words, it doesn't have a backbone. The other category of invertebrate chordates is the one we're about to see here, the Urochordata, and this is called tunicates. Tunicates are very odd creatures. They don't look much like you would expect to see a creature in this category, but they are more closely related to the other chordates than are the lancelets. And tunicates really only have the characteristics of a chordate very early on in their embryonic development during their larval stage, and it sounds crazy, but their larval stage may only last for a few minutes, a number of minutes. So when they go through this larval stage, they will rapidly change and their body morphs into something quite different as an adult. As an adult, a tunicate draws in water through an opening, what we call a siphon, an in-current siphon, and filters out whatever floating food is in the water, and then expels that water through another type of outgoing siphon. Sometimes they're called sea squirts because they can shoot out like a jet of water, kind of like if you hold a water balloon but you have the open end, the end hasn't been tied up, and you squeeze it and squirt the water out. It's kind of what it looks like. Tunicates are highly derived and have fewer Hox genes than other vertebrates. So these guys are quite a bit unlike some of the other chordates that we're going to take a look at. So here they are. Here is a larva. It has all 4 of the characteristics. And then here's the adult, and here's what it looks like. Here's an actual picture. It doesn't look like much of what you're going to see of the rest of the creatures coming up in the category. So this is another example of an invertebrate chordate. We only have 2 categories of those. All the other chordates that we look at from this point forward will be vertebrates. The evolution of chordates, probably early on the ancestral common ancestor probably resembled a lancelet. The same Hox genes. Remember, Hox genes are these regulatory genes that it's a gene, but it also controls other genes, or like master switches. The same Hox genes that organize the vertebrate brain are expressed in the lancelet's simple nerve cord tips. So although the lancelet's very simple, it has some of the same genetics that you see further later down the line in other chordates. Genome sequencing suggests that the genes associated with the heart and the thyroid are common to all chordates, and genes associated with the transmission of nerve impulses are unique to vertebrates. So you see, as we get to the vertebrates, which are also chordates, you see that we start to have some other changes, and you have some more changes and mutations in these Hox genes, and you have like genes associated with a more complex nervous system. You won't see those in these very simple, like the lancelet, and these very other simple chordates. So that's kind of where we're going to pause right there with the early chordate development. So they can say that there are some genetic similarities between some of these very early seeming creatures, or these very early common ancestor type creatures like the lancelet that still exists today. But there are some genetic similarities between, say, this lancelet and then some of the other vertebrates that we're going to take a look at coming on. But there are changes in some of the master control genes, which then go on to change some of the other genes. So they're just showing you some of the similarities between the genetics there. So we'll take a break right there, and we're going to move on to other chordates, but they're all going to be vertebrate chordates. They have a backbone, and they're also going to be with a head, a more developed head. They're called craniates, and we'll move on from there. Again, go back to that main slide that we looked at and kind of look at the categories, and that'll help you out. Let's take a break. We'll come right back.